The 21st century is a century filled with unrestrained passion and unbridled hostility toward the truth. You see, those who take a stand on the side of truth are canceled and labeled as radical ideologists who refuse to compromise and modernize their beliefs to fit societal norms. To live for God is to become the enemy of the world. This is the same type of culture that Daniel of old found himself enslaved in. As a young man, he was captured by the Babylonians who had attacked and destroyed Judah as a result of the Israelites' disobedience to God's laws that he had given to them at Mount Sinai. He was taken to Babylon to be trained in business administration and the ways of Babylon so he could serve Nebuchadnezzar in the Babylonian court. You see, Babylon did not worship or serve the God of Israel. They didn't tolerate abnormalities among their populace when it came to religion. They had a pantheon of gods, and you were expected to worship the gods. You were expected to conform to the pagan culture that made up the Babylonian Empire. Yet Daniel refused to compromise with the wokeness that reigned around him. He dared to step out in faith and honor the God who spoke the universe into existence. No matter what society believed, Daniel was going to take a stand on the side of truth. And his tests of faith that he experienced were physical, because the devil always likes going for the jugular when we take a stand for Jesus. Daniel was required to eat the pagan food that was unclean according to the law God had given to Moses. He was expected to obey the king's demands to not practice his faith later on in his life through prayer. The pressure was on. He was an enslaved subject of the Babylonian and Persian empires physically. What Babylon and Persia said you did, however, spiritually, he was a servant of God. He answered to a higher authority than Babylon or Persia. And to conform to the Babylonian and Persian culture meant to forsake his Jewish identity. It would require him to reject his faith and disavow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Daniel made a purpose. Daniel committed in his heart. He made that personal decision to reject the culture around him and remain faithful to his faith. God rewarded Daniel's faithfulness. What looked like a disaster in the making became miracles to talk about. Daniel outperformed the other court servants, even though he didn't subscribe to the Babylonian and Persian guidelines for success. His rejection of cultural norms set him up for success. God promoted Daniel because of his unwavering faithfulness. God overruled the natural with the supernatural. He rewarded Daniel openly for Daniel's obedience in secret. If you're taking notes, my first point is God works in the darkness. You see, I'm amazed at how God utilizes the darkness to complete his greatest work. It seems to be a season of loss to us, period of defeat. Darkness doesn't typically mean anything good when you look at it from a human perspective. Yet God takes the darkness and uses it to obscure his master plan until he's ready to reveal it. The darkness doesn't limit God, it enhances his work. This essential detail is vital to understand if we're ever going to make any sort of sense out of the circumstances that we often find ourselves engulfed in. If we get bogged down in our individual chapters, we'll never be able to comprehend the main storyline. God has a master plan, and each one of our lives is dedicated and directed if we're completely surrendered to God according to God's master plan. Daniel was able to grasp this truth because Daniel was dedicated to God and what God had for him. Daniel was able to see that the chapter that comprised his life story was only one of the many chapters that God had written in the story of humanity. The circumstances of Daniel's life may have seemed isolated at the time, and the circumstances of our life will certainly seem isolated in the here and now. But as Daniel's story was intertwined into the story of mankind, so is ours. The chapters that detail our lives, they're intertwined into the story that God has written. While the details seem isolated, they're all connected to the storyline that began with Adam and will culminate with the return of Jesus. The Bible is not some ancient manuscript that was written by a group of men who lived in caves hidden from the light of day. It's not a relic that doesn't have any relevance in modern society and should be put on a bookshelf to collect dust. No, the Bible is God's storybook. It details the revealed story that makes up God's master plan for planet Earth. And each one of us has a chapter in God's story. We may not have a visible chapter in the revealed story, the Bible, but we have a chapter in God's story yet to be revealed. This is the piece of the puzzle that we've got to understand if we're to make any sense of the day-to-day elements of our lives. Without a comprehension of God's story, our lives will seem chaotic and irrelevant. We'll never see how God is weaving our lives into the story plot of his master plan. We'll become confused and disillusioned unless we understand that our story is a part of a bigger story that encaptures the entire world. You see, Daniel's story doesn't seem to make a lot of sense when you view it by itself. It's only when you look at the entire snapshot of Daniel's life, when you look at the entire snapshot of the Bible, and you look through the lens of God, do we see the hand of God moving the varied pieces into their destined places. You see, darkness envelops the beginning of Daniel's story, and in a sense it clings to the entire life of Daniel. Nevertheless, God is working in that darkness. The impact of Daniel's story is far-reaching. It challenges us even today to persevere in the darkness, even when we cannot see God's hand at work. This perseverance, it's a walk of faith. You see, living by faith, living by spiritual sight and not physical sight, is the only way to live a life that's truly committed to God. Daniel had no idea how Ashpenaz would react to his dietary exception request. He couldn't see the outcome. We have an entire Bible. Daniel didn't have that. But Daniel took a stand. He stepped out from the crowd. He had to wrestle with his faith on the way to Babylon. Would he take a stand for God, or would he be swept up in the culture? And he made that decision. He wrestled with it privately, and then he was able to publicly be able to take a stand. And there comes a season in my life and your life where we are going to have to wrestle like Daniel. We're going to have to get it settled down in our heart that we will serve the Lord. In James 1:5-7, it instructs us, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering, for he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with a wind and tossed. For let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. Those who do not have it purposed in their hearts that they will serve the Lord, they're like waves driven by the wind. They're tossed back and forth between obligation to their faith and coercion to wokeism. These individuals cannot expect to receive anything from God since they're not completely committed to God. They're unstable in all their ways. There's no root system to ground them in their faith. And when the winds of adversity blow, and if they're not blowing in your life right now, give it time, they'll come along. When the winds of adversity blow and they hammer our house, our spiritual house, they hammer our metaphorical house, our life, we'll bend and we'll break, and our house will crumble and fall because there's nothing that the house is built on, nothing firm. There's nothing that we're grounded to. You see, if Daniel would not have been anchored in his faith, he would have been swept away by the godless culture that thrived around him. The darkness of Babylon would have snuffed out the light in his life if he would not have been tapped into the unquenchable light of God. Living untethered will lead to our downfall. Living untethered will lead to the destruction of our life and our spiritual house. Without the vine, if we're not attached to the vine, Jesus Christ, we'll never survive as branches. My second point is faithful amid adversity. Adversity is the test that proves our commitment to God. If we're not committed to God, then our faithfulness or faithlessness will be exhibited. When life is good, it's easy to say that we are committed to God and His plan for our life. It's easy to raise our hand at church. It's easy to sing with all of our heart. It's easy to raise our hand when we're dwelling on the mountaintop, because living on the mountaintop doesn't take a lot of effort. The valleys are where our faithfulness or lack thereof is on full display. The bad medical report, the depleted financial resources, the wayward child, the broken relationship, or the unrelenting addiction is where our faithfulness is called to action. Getting squeezed is the process that develops commitment and ingenuity within us. There would be no lemonade if lemons never got squeezed, and faith-filled Christians would not be born if adversity was withheld. Like the pain of a human childbirth, adversity is experienced so we can be born into the family of God. The child is born through pain into an earthly family, and we are born through pain into a heavenly family. But once the birthing process is finished, the joy of being a part of that family far outweighs the pain that we had to endure. See, Daniel had to encourage himself in the Lord. There came a point where he had to encourage himself and the foundation that he was built upon, Jesus Christ, because the adversity that surrounded him was discouraging. He had to remain committed even in the small areas of his life, so he would remain committed with his entire life. Little foxes tend to spoil the vine. Engaging in small compromises leads to lifestyle adjustments. We go from being on fire for God to being lukewarm social Christians. Often we allow the adversity to make us bitter. What God wants to use to make us better, the devil uses to make us bitter, and the bitterness causes us to blow off opportunities to share the gospel because we're too concerned about getting back to our comfort zone. Daniel could have been concerned with his comfort. He could have let his dietary conviction slide. He could have made the decision that he wasn't going to rock the boat. However, if Daniel hadn't focused on the earthly distractions, he would have never seen the heavenly story unfolding through the daily commitments of faith that he made. When I write sermons, I try to contemplate how each member of the audience can take the sermon and apply it to their individual life. I attempt to picture various segments of the audience and try to see the world through their eyes, because I don't want to take up time with aimless words. I want the message to apply to your life and mine. The life of Daniel is reflected in ours. You could drop Daniel in the 21st century and he would fit right in. The similarities are so pronounced that I'm astounded at how much it mirrors our life today. The same opportunities for compromise that afflicted Daniel afflict us. They're lurking today as they were for Daniel. The pressure to stand in the circle at work while your coworkers take God's name in vain. You think about extracting yourself from this conversation, but you wouldn't want to draw attention to yourself. You comfort the conviction in your heart by saying, well, it's at least it's not me who's taking God's name in vain. But friend, your silence is condoning what's going on around you. Silence is an answer in and of itself. You're silently condoning it. There's pressure in school for children to assimilate into the culture around them. It's very intense as a young adult. In my day, it was called fitting in. The peer pressure can cause you to rehinge, to want to fit in. So you rehinge, you walk back your commitment to God because you want to seem cool to the world. Well, I know it's not popular to talk about. There's pressure to gossip. An individual approaches you at church, small group, and they just have to tell you what's on their mind about so-and-so. You know you should stop them and provide godly correction because God condemns gossiping in Proverbs. He calls it an abomination, but you wouldn't want to come off as rude. In fact, at times you desire to engage in this destructive habit of dissecting other people's lives behind their backs. The compromise might come packaged in different wrapping paper today, but the core elements are the same as it was in Daniel's day. We're in new days, but the old demons still linger. My dad shared this piece of advice to us children that his mother had shared with him. She told him never to tell a lie, because after you told the first lie, you'd have to tell a second lie to cover up the first lie, and the third lie to cover up the second lie, and it would just snowball out of control. Once compromise is allowed in your life, it begins to spiral out of control. Don't fool yourself into believing that you can control compromise once it's taken root in your life. Like an infection, untreated, it spreads until it's completely contaminated you. If Daniel had bowed down to the Babylonian culture and accepted their dietary regimen, he would have opened the door to sin, because he would have been trusting in the king instead of trusting in the King of Kings. I'm challenged by God's conversation with Cain after Cain expressed his anger and resentment at not having his offering accepted by God. We talked about this in last week's episode, but I think it bears repeating. God tells Cain some profound words. He says, if you do what is right, won't you be accepted? If you do what is wrong, sin is lurking at your door. Sin will want to have dominion over you, but you must subdue it. How dynamic is this conversation, right? It blows my mind. God is spot on, which I'm confident that he is all the time, but God's words speak to me in a way that only he can. When I do wrong, when you do wrong, when I compromise, when you compromise, sin is lurking at our door. It longs to conquer us, but we must trust the power of God manifested through the Holy Spirit to subdue it. Not even 1 inch of metaphorical ground can be given to compromise. You cannot entertain woke ideologies and expect to remain untainted. You can't take a portion of the king's meat and expect to be undefiled. Daniel couldn't indulge in the food of Babylon and remain devoted to God. There comes a moment in time where we must declare, like Joshua had to declare, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Doesn't matter what society does, doesn't matter what our coworkers do, doesn't matter what other church members do, it doesn't matter what our classmates do, it doesn't matter what our spouse or family does. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. There came a time when Noah took himself and his family and headed into the ark. He had preached for decades and nobody listened to him. There came a time where the age of mercy was over, and Noah went into the ark. He distanced himself from the culture around him. He took a stand. And friends, that day is here in the U.S. We're at that moment in time where we must take a stand on the side of truth. Our values are under attack daily by radical woke revolutionists who desire to dismantle the biblical foundation this country was founded on. Like Babylon, they seek to disassociate us from our Christian identity. Their goal is to brainwash us and transform us into woke zombies controlled by the forces of darkness. Killing babies is not enough. They seek to completely overhaul God's creative design for humanity by relabeling men as women and women as men. Like the diabolical citizens of Israel during the days before the exile, those woke revolutionists in those days sacrificed their children to demons. They sacrificed their children. They put their firstborn through the fire. They sacrificed them to get the favor of the gods. And friends, don't underestimate what Planned Parenthood and the rest of the abortion clinics are doing today, that it's not on the same level as what was going on in Israel before the exile. New days, old demons. You see, these radical revolutionists want to go after our children's morality by teaching homosexual and transgender philosophy in grade school. They want to completely rip the fabric of our country apart. It began with taking prayer out of schools, and they're not going to stop because their master knows no bounds. They know no bounds. Daniel didn't take the threats of Babylon lightly, and neither should we take these threats lightly. You see, because God is looking for women and men and boys and girls to stand in the gap and build up the hedge, individuals who will be like Daniel and not defile themselves. They'll take a stand for the right. They'll stand against the wrong. They'll stand on the side of truth. They'll reject the lies of the devil, and they will stand firmly on the word of God. My third and final point is purposeful passion. What's the one thing in your life that you're passionate about? Ponder that question for a moment. Reflect on how your eyes light up when you engage in your passion. Your mind becomes alert. You do your best not to miss one moment of the journey. I'm sure some of your bosses wish you were that passionate about your work as you are about your hobby in life. And some of us, we get the distinct pleasure of being able to engage with our passion in our careers on a daily basis. And others of us, we have to pursue our passion and our free time as a hobby. But regardless of how much time we get to spend pursuing our passion, it remains alive within us. Daniel had a passion that he pursued relentlessly. It's a passion that all of us should cultivate and should strive to engage in. Daniel was passionate about his faith. You see, Daniel had a purpose. He purposed to remain committed to God no matter the circumstances of his life. I call that purposeful passion, a passion that has a purpose. There was substance behind Daniel's passion. His eternal soul was at stake. And he could give in to the circumstances that he found himself in. He could be defined by them and not by the might of the God he served. It would have been easy to get swept up in the Babylonian sensual pursuit of the flesh as a distraction. Daniel was in some pretty dire circumstances. He was a slave. When he was offered the smorgasbord by the king, I bet the king's food looked good. It tasted even better. It wasn't some McDonald's Big Mac. It was a Ruth Chris T-bone all the way. Yet Daniel knew, like Eve found out, that looks can be deceiving. Being passionate, it's wonderful. However, the object of your passion can be deadly. Sin is a passionate object. It's an object that gives you pleasure. And there's no denying the fact that sin can be fun, yet sin has an ending. Like our earthly passions have an expiration date, sinful pursuits have an expiration date. Paul warns us in Romans that the wages of sin are death. Everything that is earthly, everything that we can see has an ending of death. Only the eternal ceases to end and provides life abundant and free. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines purposeful as having a purpose, meaningful, intentional. Our faith has to be intentional. James tells us that to only hear the word and not do it is like a man who goes into the bathroom, looks in the mirror, then walks out of the bathroom and forgets what he looks like. Seems pretty crazy, right? But too often, that's how Christians treat their faith. They hear the word, they hear a good message, but they never act upon it, and they forget about it as life moves on and ebbs and flows. See, if Daniel's faith had no purpose, if there was no substance to it, no intention behind it, he would have abandoned it once he reached Babylon. The Bible tells us that the children of the world are often more intelligent than the children of the kingdom. That's often caused me to stumble. Why? Why are they more intelligent than those of the kingdom? You see, they're more intelligent because worldly-minded individuals are passionate. There's a meaning behind their passion, self-indulgence. They seek to gratify their flesh. Often Christians have no passion about their faith. They show up to church on Sunday to mark another achievement off their holy works chart. Their faces are drawn. They're sad looking. I know I shouldn't say it, but it's never stopped me before. I appreciate your forgiveness in advance. They look like shriveled up prunes. There's no joy in them. There's no hope. They're like dead zombies using muscle memory to get them through their religious duties. On the other hand, the world, they're alive. They're full of purposeful passion. They reach, they grasp, they do whatever it takes to achieve the next level of sinful success. We wonder why our churches are emptying and the theaters are filling up. The answer lies in our passion. We're not passionate about our faith. If we were in a conversation with an unsaved individual who challenged our beliefs, many Christians could not defend the beliefs they claim to hold. You want to get our churches full again? You want to see revival spread throughout the world? You got to get passionate about your faith. There has to be substance behind your faith. There has to be intention behind your faith. Taking a stand for what you believe is never going to be easy. It places pressure on you because the world is watching. They're taking note of your life to see if you live the way that you talk. The world will 100% call you out for being a hypocrite. I recently saw an article that said to the effect pastors are no longer considered standard bearers of good morals. Sadly, I'd have to agree with this assessment. Too often we get our eyes off of the object of our passion, or what I should say should be our passion, Jesus Christ. We begin to drift. When we get our eyes off of Jesus, we begin to drift, just like Peter began to sink when he was walking on the water when he got his eyes off of Jesus. Let's face it, as Christians, there's nothing more important than Jesus Christ and his finished work on the cross. It's the foundation of our faith. Yet we can lose sight of Jesus through the dust clouds thrown up by the world and its distractions. Daniel could have been overwhelmed by the distractions of Babylon. The thrill of the city was intoxicating. It was the hub of cultural and commercial activities. It was the center of the world at that time. You could equate it to New York City or Los Angeles. If you wanted to be somebody and you wanted to go somewhere in life, you ended up in Babylon. The thrill of the city, being in the center of it all, had to be overpowering in and of itself. However, Daniel refused to be moved in his faith. It didn't matter where he was. He knew God. He knew God was watching. It didn't matter whether he was in Judah or whether he was in Babylon or somewhere in between. He knew God was watching. Daniel kept his faith at the forefront of his mind despite all of the allurements surrounding him. This constant contemplation of his faith is what kept him from being undefiled. What we dwell on sets the tone of our walk. We will either walk with God or we're going to walk with the world. The thoughts, the ideas, the passions that fill our mind, it'll be where our soul gravitates to. It's vital to have a purposeful passion for our faith in God.